I feel like I have 15 years left where I'm physically and mentally going to be able to make a contribution and not be dead weight. And so I'm excited about how I end up investing.
Jeez, James, that means I'm dead weight in 3 years. Holy cow.
Yeah, I was wondering.
I better get to it.
I see the sunset on my career around that point.
Hey everyone, thanks for joining me today. With me today on my podcast, my dear friend and former independent paint retailer, James Pace. James was a single store dealer in Alabama who was in the business for around 20 years. What makes his story interesting to me and why I wanted to have him on, even though he just left the business, is really how he got in and how he got out of the business, because it's an unusual story that I don't think many dealers get in the way that he did or get out the way that he did. James was sort of a serial entrepreneur, had 2 degrees, and had worked in several different industries and managed to land upon the paint business, buying a store, like I said, some 20 years ago from the beginning, intending just to build the store up into a profitable operation and then immediately sell it and move on to something else. And I find that alone unusual. Most of the paint dealers I know either came into the business the way I did through some sort of family channel and stayed in through their career, or bought a store or 5 stores and stayed in over the course of their careers. But very few dealers that I know actually leave the industry early. James is in his 40s with plans to work and do something else for the next 20 years of their career. The other thing that I find really interesting about James and his time in the paint industry is James is the only dealer that I'm aware of who sold his business for a significant multiple over EBITDA. So that is a multiple of his earnings before interest and dividends and tax and depreciation as well. And so that's interesting. I've been involved. I've shared this before in my blog and even here in my podcast. I've been involved over the years in I don't know how many sales of how many paint stores, and I've known even about hundreds more over the course of my 30-year careers. I know of very few, maybe 0, that sold for a significant multiple of earnings. When James and I were talking about that after he sold his stores, he told me that that was by design. That was his intent from the very beginning, and he had a plan on exactly how to do that. And so I thought it would be interesting, particularly for the dealers that follow along, to hear about how James did it and think about how some of his lessons can apply to your business at some point. We all do get older and we all do need to get out of our businesses. So give James a listen. Let me know what you think. Brian, put my cell phone number up there. Shoot me a text. Let me know what you think of this episode or any of the other work I'm doing. Like and subscribe, and we'll see you on the next episode. Hey everyone, thanks for joining me today. With me today on my podcast is my very dear friend, James Pace. James, good morning. How are you?
Good morning. Good morning.
And James, I've shared with you before, you're the only dealer that I've ever met who got into owning paint stores with the intention of just having this as a portion of your career and then getting out on that plan. And then the other thing that I thought made for an interesting episode is you're the only paint dealer I'm aware of that sold their store for a multiple of their earnings. And so those are the things that I really want to talk about. I thought we'd start with just you sharing a little bit of your career and then specifically your paint career, what led to where you're at now.
Well, yeah, absolutely. And thanks again for having me on. My career in the paint business began 20 years ago. My past was that of academia. I was in graduate school. I was on a path to teaching. Economics was my concentration and my passion. And
you have 2 degrees, if I'm not mistaken, right?
I do have 2 master's degrees. That's correct.
That brings up the averages in Alabama, you know.
That's right. There's 3
when one guy has 2 degrees, man, that messes up the math.
Yeah. And so, I got engaged to my bride and current wife and mother of my children along that way. And so earning a paycheck kind of took place of the dream of teaching. Did teach for a couple of years, taught accounting, and I really enjoyed that and maybe hope to return to teaching at some point. It's extremely rewarding. But anyways, I got back to Birmingham. I grew up here, but I was gone for about 10 years. And then I got back to Birmingham and really got into starting businesses, doing startup businesses and getting them up and running. And then once you had a couple of years of financials in place, selling those, and I was able to do that twice. And then I got involved with the paint business. A friend of mine that was a broker said, "Hey, have you thought about the paint industry?" And I really had not, but it was shortly after Warren Buffett had made his, entrance into the paint industry. And so I felt like it was at least worth exploring. And so long story short, I bought a paint store that was in bankruptcy, basically from the vendors 19 and a half years ago. And that was Rainbow Paint and Decorating. And so I figured that would be a 5 to 7 year event. It turned into 20 for multiple reasons.
Because but it was the paint industry is quicksand. That's always been my impression.
Yeah. And there's certainly that aspect of it, but, I really enjoyed it as well. I thought it was a fun way to make a living, and, was able to take my dog to work with me every day, and I was able to leave my suit and tie in the closet. And so there was a lot of things I really liked about it. And I got to one of the greatest pleasures is my father was my partner in the business until 2012. And so I was able to work with him, which was a life dream of mine. He's an entrepreneur and business background. He did not have a paint background either. And so he and I showed up day one on the job, and our employees started training us. And so that's where the ride began.
And so you're one of the few dealers I know of who sold their business for a multiple of EBITDA plus the assets. EBITDA meaning the earnings before interest and depreciation and probably a few other things. Most paint stores that I'm aware of, they basically just sell for assets, and if you're lucky, a few pennies of goodwill, but mostly just for assets. But you actually got a multiple of earnings. Let's talk a little bit about how you were able to make that possible.
So, yeah, great question. I guess I would just like to say that I felt like from day one, and I still feel like now, that the independent paint retailers should be sold for a multiple of earnings plus assets.
I agree. But in stores do, True Value stores do.
That's right. But in order to do that, paint stores have to run themselves in a certain manner to create that value. And that's not typical. And it certainly wasn't typical when we got to looking at Rainbow Paint, when we were looking at buying it during that due diligence process. It became very apparent that the owner was running the store in a way to show the least amount of profit in order to pay the least amount of taxes. And including, very little cash business was being reported. And so we all know what that means.
Yep.
And so basically he chose to take the benefit or the equity. He was robbing the equity out of the business in order to save on his tax bill. And so therefore, when it comes time to sell the business, there's no value there, because let me tell you what, an investor that we want in this industry is not going to take your word for anything. And so if you've been robbing from, right? Yeah, nor should they.
Nor should they. I've had dealers looking to sell say to me, "Well, listen, here's my statement from Benjamin Moore. You could see I bought $1.5 million last year. Doesn't that impute some sort of value?" Well, no, not if you didn't make any money off of it.
So that was one piece of it, that we felt like, dealers have to be willing to make that commitment to having their books reviewed monthly. Which in Alabama, I'm sure it's different in every region of the country, but you're looking at somewhere, the $7,000 to $12,000 a year line item expense for legal and accounting to have that done. But I think over time you'll prove to get that money back plus some, and so that's the correct way to run it, instead of the kind of mom and pop way of, oh, we'll just make this adjustment here, adjustment there. It's being willing to make that investment in the business, and you're not making that investment on behalf of your vendors. You're making that investment on behalf of your portfolio.
And so to create that sort of equity, it sounds to me like you did a lot of things that other paint dealers don't do, or I should say other paint dealers do a lot of things that you didn't do. For example, running your cars through your business, and your dinners with your spouses and stuff like that, which all goes through your business. Your point is that at the end, all of that costs you your equity if you're a dealer and you're doing that. Is that right?
That's right. That's right. And so, it's the Fram oil filter marketing campaign, pay me now or pay me later, and so And, and my CPA told me a long time ago, which he's been a great mentor in my life, is that, his goal for me is for me to pay a tremendous amount of taxes every year.
Right.
And because if I'm doing that, I'm making a lot of money, and I'm making a lot of money, I'm creating equity in my business. And so if you look at your inventory and you divide that up into A, B, C, and D items, and really, C and D items are almost items that you could go without, certainly D items, and move those to a special order kind of status. Your A and B items are tremendously valuable and you can't do business without them. So why not pay cash and buy as much of that as you can? And so, and the mistake that you can get in there is there's always those snares with, and not all of them are snares, but there's always that, risk of all these buying promos that vendors offer, and rebates and dating and all that sort of stuff. And that is a useful tool, don't get me wrong, but it's also a slippery slope, because if you bring in A and B items and you sell through those quickly, but you're on 90-day dating, by the time you get to 90 days, you've removed that asset off your books, and all you've got left is the liability. So therefore, long-term in your business, if you
hopefully and the cash that you sold the paint for.
That's right.
Right.
And some of that cash gets eat up with overhead. And so
right.
You really have to watch that. A lot of those dating orders, they really benefit the manufacturer, and so, and having good relationships with your vendors are important, but they're not as important as your business. We are not, I always looked at it as I was not in the paint industry. I was in business, that was the focus, and it was always about what was best to create value on my balance sheet. And that was always the focus. And sometimes that aligns with your vendors and sometimes it does not. And when it does not, you have to align with your stockholders, which is you and your family and your employees. That's who you're responsible to, not the vendors.
It sounds to me, James, like you had a strategy that called for very high turns of I guess your A and B products, but also opportunistic buying. Is that what I'm divining from that?
Yeah, it's certainly a hybrid. And I think step one, and I think that was what was kind of fun about our perspective, is I didn't know the difference between, an A item and a D item if it hit me in the face when I walked in and started taking over that business. So step one, if you're not involved enough in your business to know, step one, identify what your A and B items are, and those C and D items that you love to have and your reps kind of want you to keep on the shelf to keep showing, kind of look at that and see if that's benefiting you. And so, but, step one, identify what they are. And then when you can, and I love this analogy, if you're McDonald's, the D item is the fruit cup that nobody ever orders. They could be out of it for a week. Nobody would know it. You roll in there and they're out of French fries, you got a serious problem. So if you're McDonald's, French fries is an A item. And so I think that's the best analogy that I've got. And so identify what those A items are in your store. And every time you have the ability to pay cash for them and slow the turns. I did come in from a standpoint of high turns on your A and B items. And I thought that was great because that was tying up the least amount of my cash. But over time, my perspective kind of changed where, hey, I've got an extra few bucks in my pocket, let's cost of goods sold, which is a good thing to manage on the accounting side. Let's load up on those A items, and I always really wanted to do that going into winter. It puts me in a position where come spring, I have full shelves of paid for inventory to where when I came in the business, come spring, you're always low on inventory and you didn't have any cash because you just survived winter and your taxes due.
That was me, by the way. Yeah. That was me. I didn't know you were watching.
Yeah, and it's April 15th, and so you go to the tax man.
Right.
And so the way you have to get out in front of that is you're going to maybe have to borrow some money to get through spring, but borrow it from yourself. Borrow it from your inventory, of inventory you've bought correctly, and then you have the opportunity to make a 40, 50% return on it. And there's nothing that you can make that kind of return on in the market.
Rather than paying a bank for getting return, rather than paying a bank interest for that money. And so I find this really interesting because there are a number of dealers who are listening to this who have, 5, 6 plus stores. And they're listening to you and they're thinking, well, James, you're not exactly shedding any great light here. But the smaller dealers, that don't have a sophisticated sort of view of their business and their management of the finances of their business. A lot of this is new. If you've got one or two stores, your inventory is still a very significant part of your total investment in the business. And so I think what James is saying is how you manage that ultimately is going to determine whether or not you're creating equity or just creating income.
That's certainly one piece of it for sure. But, there was a point in my paint career, I had the opportunity to visit just about every paint dealer in the state of Alabama. It was a New Year's resolution of mine, and it was tied to some other opportunities. And so I really, really enjoyed that. And each store I visited, I would get after we sat down and talked shop, I'd get the business owner to take me to the local barbecue store, and so barbecue restaurant. And so it turned into a paint and barbecue tour of Alabama. And so some great stories and characters came out of that experience. But typical paint operation I saw is, you'd go in and you'd look at their inventory on any given point in time. Because of the turns of the A and B items, they were always low on their A and B items. They were always heavy on C and D items, and they always had a healthy payables to their vendors, and they also had healthy receivables to their contractors. And so the time you clean all that up without getting too deep into it, there wasn't a whole lot of value there. And I don't care what sort of volume you're doing, whether you're doing 100 million or whether you're doing a million, the math at the end of the day is the same. You have to reverse that. I think you've met yourself a wise paint person / business owner when you walk in their store and there's so many A and B items, there's no room for C and D items, and they have people have very low receivables and very low payables. That guy or girl knows what they're doing.
Yeah, for sure. And part of this is one of the problems that I think small retailers in general suffer from, or at least many of them that I've known, is that they underfund their business. They have a tendency to, take out a couple extra dollars because there's nobody there to stop us. I've done this myself, right, over the course of my career, because there's nobody there to stop you from writing yourself a check. And sometimes you really hamper your business. And if you reduce your equity by doing that, then of course you're reducing the amount that you get to sell at the end as a multiple. If I take out $1 today, it's worth $1. If I leave it in until I sell it, it's worth, $2.50 or $3.50.
Right.
Well, tell me a little bit about your experience selling the store, because that's really interesting to me. Not just that you were able to manage the business itself in such a way that you were able to sell it at a multiple. That in and of itself is rare enough. But tell me about how you went about the business of selling it. Did it sell to an existing paint dealer?
It did not. It sold to a local investor.
So how did you find this prospective buyer?
Well, she found us. She was a client of ours, and we had finished up a relatively large project at their farm. They were doing a remodel job on, because they had moved here from Pennsylvania and they had gotten kind of settled at home. And then they were looking for businesses to invest in, and had been looking for about a year and couldn't find any business that they trusted the financials. And so not only did she and her husband kind of fall in love with our business and our staff, my least tenured team member had been with me 13 years. And kind of, walking away from some of those relationships, from, at least on a daily basis, was certainly a hard part of the decision. Certainly consider those people family and wish them well moving forward. And I think they will do well moving forward. But she approached me about possibly selling the business. And I thought she was really just trying to be kind and compliment us, and then quickly realized it was more than that. And we began a due diligence process that took about 2 months. It moved pretty quickly. I would say the whole process was, once we kind of got into it, was 10 weeks, something like that. And so anyways, that week we closed on December 31st. I've been out of the industry now, I guess, for 6 weeks.
As prep for this, you had used the term leverage imbalance, which I actually made a note of. In a good, healthy relationship, you should feel like you understand what it is that you give your vendors and what it is that you get from them. And there needs to be some balance between that, right? The fulcrum needs to be roughly in the center. And I understand there are some dealers that will say things like, well, I'm just a local dealer. I have 1 or 2 stores. How can I be in the middle of that? How can my fulcrum be in the middle against, Benjamin Moore or Hunter Douglas or Pittsburgh or any of these big players? But there are strategies that you can use. One of them that I used in my business often, which I've blogged about frequently and often has gotten me in trouble with my relationships with my paint vendors when I did have stores, was the idea of never having just one paint vendor. Right. I never had just one paint vendor. As a matter of fact, I just blogged. I don't know if you caught my blog this week. I was writing about a guy who worked for me for about 25 years or so and found a mixing stick from a store that he had opened when he was the manager there. And it had on there, it had all the brands. And at the time, this would have been in around the year 2000. At the time, we were stocking dealers of PPG, Pratt and Lambert, and Benjamin Moore at that new store. And I felt that was, to me, a strategy that made it possible for me to keep that fulcrum towards the center so that the leverage imbalance was somewhat close. I should say the leverage was somewhat close to balance. And so that's why when you said that, I was like, wow, James kind of got a strategy like I tried to employ over the course of my career.
That's right. And having that mixture of vendors gives you the opportunity to run your sales at a 40 to 50% margin, which is where you should be in this industry. And if anybody's trying to convince you should be in the mid 30s, they probably work for a manufacturer.
Right.
And so, because if you're selling paint in the mid 30s on accounts to painters, you're not making money. You may be churning some cash through your business, but you're not seeing the profits that you could be seeing. And so, and there's several ways to address that. Obviously, if you're in a very dense market with other dealers around you, it's harder to do that, but you still can do that by bringing products to your market that aren't currently there. The last several years I was in the industry, I was interested to talk to any manufacturer that did not have distribution in Alabama or the Southeast. Almost exclusively, that's who I wanted to speak with. If there was another dealer down the road and had your product and you were trying to get me to bring it in, that's just playing into the manufacturer's hand of getting more distribution on the backs of the independent. And I wasn't interested in playing that game.
And so now that you're sort of at the end, what's in store for you?
I don't know. That's what, Emily and I have had a lot of fun late night conversations, kind of dreaming about what's next. Fortunately, I have time. I don't have to rush into anything. And so I don't know if I'm staying in the industry or not. I'm certainly looking at doing that, but I didn't.
Would you buy another business, James, or are you looking to work for somebody? What's your plan?
I'm not sure. I don't think I'm looking for a job at this point. Certainly looking for an investment opportunity, maybe in this channel or maybe not. What Emily and I are doing is we're leaving the door open for the Lord to lead us where we need to be. And as I sit here today, I don't know. I want to go somewhere where I can make a contribution to where, my personality type is a problem solver. I would get tremendous satisfaction out of being able to step in somewhere and help somebody solve a problem and bring value. And, but at the same time, not looking for a job. I think I've been working for myself for a long time, and that would be an interesting transition. But, if that's where the Lord leads, that's where he leads, and
I had, when I sold my stores, I had a 1-year agreement in place with Benjamin Moore and to work for them as a consultant, and then really no plans beyond that. And what I would say is that if you're looking for opportunities within this space, they exist, right? And so just keep your eyes open to anything that meets the criteria that you're looking for. And it wouldn't necessarily have to be another, paint store. I don't know why you would want to own another paint store, but there are all sorts of businesses that are dealing in this space where you could basically keep a lot of your network around you and take advantage of having that same network around you while still doing something else.
Yeah. And I love this industry. And so I love talking about it, as you can probably tell over this
Yep.
segment. I
Yep.
can. So certainly open to that, and certainly, I figure I have 15 years left. I'm about to be 46. I feel like I have 15 years left where I'm physically and mentally going to be able to make a contribution and not be dead weight. And so I'm excited about how I end up investing.
Jeez, James, that means I'm dead weight in 3 years. Holy cow.
Yeah, I was wondering. I better get to it. Yeah. I see the sunset on my career being around that point. And so, but maybe not, and so I'm not the personality type. I'm not going to sit at home. I'm a busybody until about 4 or 5 o'clock in the afternoon. And then that's when I kind of run out of juice. I'm a morning person. And so, Emily's not going to let me sit around the house very long.
James, I've always considered you one of my closest friends in the industry. And so I really wish you the very best of luck. And I hope that you're able to find something. And I hope that you'll come on and update us on how your post-dealership life is going.
Great. Well, hey, thank you so much for having me on today. And it's been a real joy, and it's been a real pleasure getting to know you and consider you a close friend too. And I know you and I will continue to have conversations about this industry and this channel, and because we both are obviously passionate about that.